Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. Welcome to another session of our Islam Study Circle. There has been a break of 2 weeks. We are now reconnecting from where we left off, and as has been the custom in our sessions, that we divide them into two parts. One of the first segment relates to some texts that we study, and the second segment actually relates to some of the common misconceptions that go under the label of Islam. So, you must be seeing the text that we are going to study on your screen. Uh, so the Quranic verses that I've selected for today are from Surah Anfal, and they are verses 2 to 4. And the label that I've given these Quranic verses is True Faith. Now, let me start off by saying that there are places in the Quran which have a very strong emotional appeal. And besides them, there are also other places in the Quran which have a very strong intellectual appeal. And there are still other places in the Quran in which both this element of emotional appeal and intellectual appeal, you'll find them to be amalgamated. They are intertwined with one another. And it seems to me that the verses that we're going to study today actually is an instance of this third category in which all not only the intellectual aspect is described in the Quran regarding a particular aspect, but also there is a very strong emotional appeal which you can find and see in the way we will study these verses. And those of you who have even a little bit knowledge of Arabic will see how powerful these words are and how potent their influence is on our hearts if they are directly understood. So let me start off with the text and translation of these verses. They read, إنما المؤمنون الذين إذا ذكر الله وجلت قلوبهم وإذا تليت عليهم آياته زادتهم إيمانا وعلى ربهم يتوكلون الذين يقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون أولئك هم المؤمنون حقا لهم درجات عند ربهم ومغفرة ورزق كريم. True believers are those whose hearts are filled with awe at the mention of God, and when His revelations are recited before them, their faith grows stronger, and they are ones who trust their Lord alone, show diligence in their prayer, and spend for our cause from what we have given them. It is these who are true believers. For them are ranks before their Lord, forgiveness and a noble sustenance. So even a translation of these verses can tell you how powerful and how potent these words are, the way they have been described and stated here. Just see as a starter how the beginning of this section of verses has comes before us. So it says, "Innamal mu'minun lazina iza zukirallahu wajilat qulubuhum." True believers are those whose hearts are filled with awe at the mention of God. So it's like saying when God is mentioned to them, when the Almighty's name is mentioned before them in any form, it could be His attributes, it could be His own proper name. Merely mentioning the name of the Almighty fills us with a certain awe, and this is because of our tremendous respect for our Creator, and also for the fact that we love Him a lot and we would not like to make Him angry with us. So, intense love, intense awe, which stems from the fact that we have a very deep attachment to our Creator, is something that makes us very, very emotional at times when we hear God being mentioned, when we hear that people are referring to God in some of their dealings. It could be by just saying Alhamdulillah or Jazakallah or Astaghfirullah. All these are ways of mentioning the Almighty through His attributes and through some of His practices and dealings with all of us. So the beginning part of these verses tells us that how we are filled with this great awe and respect for the Almighty when we find Him, that He is being mentioned before us. And the next part is even more powerful. You see, It says, وَإِذَا تُلِيَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتُهُ زَادَتْهُمْ إِيمَانًا وَعَلَى رَبِّهِمْ يَتَوَكَّلُونَ. Actually, if you connect, you'll find out that the true faith which is found in a believer is being referred to here. And the true faith, it tells us that whenever the scripture is recited before the believers, when they read the scripture, they find that their inner heart is being strengthened, their inner soul is being nourished, their inner element or their innermost thoughts are being refreshed. And the verse says, Zadathum imana. So whenever the verses of the Almighty are recited before people, their iman, their faith increases, it grows stronger, and they are the ones who trust their Lord alone. They don't trust anyone as they trust their Lord. So when the verses of the Quran are recited before true believers, what makes their faith strengthened or being strengthened, or what makes their faith grow? It is the fact that when what they find being mentioned in the book of God, in the form of promises, in the form of warnings, in the form of glad tidings, a believer, a true believer, comes face to face with these. He realizes the promises which have been fulfilled. He also is aware of the threats and warnings that are right before him if he or she is not working his or her way according to what the Almighty has prescribed. And also, as the verse spells out, وَعَلَىٰ رَبِّهِمْ يَتَوَكَّلُونَ, that these true believers are one who have absolutely no fear of anyone because they truly trust the Almighty. They truly have faith in Him. They rely on Him entirely. They consign their matter to Him whenever they feel sorrowful, whenever they are aggrieved, whenever some calamity strikes them. They have this supreme trust in the Almighty and they rely on Him. And this is how their faith grows, and this is how their attachment to God grows. And I always point out this fact that the greatest asset that a person can have, the greatest thing that he can boast about is this God connection. The stronger our connection with the Almighty, the better we will feel as His ordinary servants and His ordinary creatures. So this is how these verses introduce to us, to true believers, and we do aspire to become true believers, that when the name of the Almighty's attributes are mentioned before us, we we are awestruck. When the verses of the Quran are recited before us, we think as if our faith has increased. Why? Because we find the truth in those verses. We find the promises which those verses make, they are being fulfilled. And ultimately, this manifests itself in our supreme and a very deep trust in the Almighty. And then you can see these verses go on to describe how true believers conduct themselves in their daily routines. It says, "Allazina yuqimuna salat," that true believers are those who are diligent in offering the prayer. And this diligence, of course, means that they not only are very regular, very punctual, but also they try their best to concentrate in the prayer. Today, we are often led off in our prayers. Often get distracted in our prayers because of a number of reasons, and we keep solving all the problems of the world in the prayer and keep getting distracted. And the reason perhaps is that we seldom concentrate on what are we reading, on what we are actually reciting in the prayer. So it is of paramount importance that we must understand what we are saying in the namaz and in the prayer, and at the same time we also should have a strong connection with the Almighty by reciting various surahs of the Quran and having a fair amount of variety in this recital, so that we are able to learn by hearts many surahs of the Quran, of course, by their meanings as well. And then reciting these various surahs in the Quran, this will produce that variety in our prayer, that strength in our prayer, which really connect us very deeply to the Almighty. The verses go on to say that true believers are those who spend in our way, or who spend from the sustenance which the Almighty has given them. So this is clearly something which is also very, very motivating for us, that we should spend whatever we have for the cause of God. Whatever little we have, we must never shy away. Even if we have a couple of pennies, that is sufficient for us. because at times the Almighty wants to test us whether whatever we have, is it available for His cause or not. So it's not a question of spending a lot, it's a question of spending whatever we have in our hands. And if we are able to do so, this is a great success, I would say, in the test that we have been put through. At the same time, dear viewers, we must also think that spending in the way of God is a very, very profound act of ritual of worship. When we are spending on our brethren, it has been made part of our worship ritual. And how do we do it? Of course, one of the reasons, one of the etiquette of spending in the way of God is that we must never show off. We must never present our spendings in His way as to other people as if we want to boast about them. This ostentatiousness in spending in the way of God is something which is discouraged, except only if we think that we are in trying to encourage our children or maybe some people in our surroundings. So at times we need to tell what we have been done. Also spend before such people so that they get inspired and motivated. Apart from these exceptions, dear viewers, it is not advisable that this spending in the way of God be made public. And then, in fact, as verses of the Quran tell us that if we hide our infaq, if we hide what we spend for the cause of God, it will be very, very beneficial for our internal enhancement, for our spiritual enhancement. And also, as this verse ends, it says that these are the people who are true believers. So they are ones who, at the mention of the Almighty, get awestruck. They are ones who, when the verses of the Quran are recited before them, their strength, their faith grows in strength. They are ones who trust the Almighty. They are ones who are diligent in their prayer, and they are ones who really wholeheartedly spend in the cause of the Almighty. So the verse says, Ulaika humul mu'minuna haqqa. It is these people, it is such type of people who are true believers. And then at the end of the second verse of this section is the reward, is the consequence of this whole attitude. It says, Lahum darajatun inda rabbihim wa maghfiratun wa rizqun kareem. Again, these verses and these words are so powerful and they are so moving that if we have even a slight bit of understanding of the Arabic of these verses, it really gets the better of us. It really has a very profound effect on us. So the words say that for such people, they are ranks before the Almighty, darajatun inda rabbihim, which means, of course, that these people will occupy a very high status before the Almighty. And then the other thing it mentioned is maghfirah, forgiveness. And what better a reward can a believer reap than being forgiven by the Almighty? And finally, the words are warizkun kareem, a noble sustenance, a noble sustenance. So, as you can see, that what is being provided by the Almighty is noble, is something which is a gift of God, something which is a blessing of God, and something which is given because of the fact that we have put in certain work, we have put in our own duty, we have spent our own life in fulfilling these obligations. So, in a nutshell, I can just say that this is one of the very powerful areas and instances of the Quran in which intellectual reasoning and emotional appeal are intertwined. They occur side by side, and it is this type of originality in the scripture which really moves a person. And you can fairly imagine that the presence of the original words of the scriptures, how effective they are in motivating us. And at times, the translation is able to convey this effectiveness, this powerful nature of the discourse. But if we are able to understand the discourse directly, the extent of this powerfulness, the extent of this potency is increased manifold. And you can well imagine that in the absence of the original words, although at times translations do have their effect, but there is no parallel of the original words. And this is what I always say, that in cases of our earlier scriptures, we have lost the original texts, only that we have the translations of these texts and translations of translations. And even then, we find that these translations have a number of aspects which really are moving and which are very powerful. But imagine if these previous scriptures were there with us with their original language as well, like the Quran, and you can clearly see what they have missed, what has been lost upon them. Although we do acknowledge that whatever does remain and whatever translations that exist, they still have their tremendous role to play. But had their originals survived the way the originals in the Quran have survived, one can well imagine how far we had gone in this motivation. So let's now move on to the next part of our section and of the segment, and that is a hadith that we generally study. Now, this hadith has been taken from the Sahih of Imam Muslim, and let me read out its text before you and the translation as well before we discuss it. The title that I've given this hadith is Cheerful Countenance. It says, عن أبي ذر قال لي النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لا تحقرن من المعروف شيئا ولو أن تلقى أخاك بوجه طلق. So it means Abu Zar said, the Prophet said to me, do not consider anything among good conduct to be insignificant. Do not think or do not consider anything among good conduct to be insignificant, even if it is as trivial as meeting your brother with a cheerful countenance. So, dear viewers, the point that has been driven home in this narrative, in this hadith, is that small acts of kindness, they always count. It's not always those large acts of kindness or those elaborate virtues that we might think of. At times, very small acts of kindness, they have their role to play. And the Prophet is actually cautioning us. He's telling us that even if you do so in a very trivial manner, if you for example, if you meet your companion or your friend with a cheerful countenance, with a smiling face, don't think that is something of a small or a trivial nature. Even this is something which can really contribute. So a thing as trivial as meeting people with a cheerful face, with a smiling face, welcoming them, being hospitable to them, merely hearing them out, is counted to be a great act of virtue. So the bottom line here is that all acts of virtue, even if they are very small, it could be like moving something of some hindrance in the path of a believer. It could be just listening to a person who is in a state of grief. It could be merely chancing upon someone and giving him your own shoulder so that he can cry on that shoulder and relieve himself of the burden that his heart is carrying. Even these small things, they do count, and they must not be regarded as insignificant. So the words are, لا تحقرن من المعروف. Don't think that anything you do good for the cause of God is trivial, is insignificant. No, it's not insignificant. It has a lot of weight in the scales of the Almighty. And the small things that we gather, these small acts of kindness that we are able to do, they all add up. They make that beautiful bouquet in which each flower stands out. The flower in itself might be very small, but when it is arranged in a magnificent bouquet, you can see how it radiates color, how it radiates beauty, how it tells us that each and every component of that bouquet has its own role to play. And when they are brought together in the form of a bouquet, in the form of a garland, you can see that each small component adds up to the beauty, adds up to the overall appearance of that bouquet. So small acts of kindness, they all add up to those huge acts of kindness. And one must never think that even if he or she has been given the chance to do something small, it's going to be insignificant. No, it is going to have its own weight in the eyes of the Almighty. And let us never shy away from these small acts of kindness. Now, my dear viewers, let us move on to the third part of our first segment. And this is actually the hadith or the Bible verse that we often read. And the Bible verse that I have selected for today's discussion is chapter number 6, verse 24. And it's from the Gospel of St. Matthew. And the title that I've given this verse is Two Masters, God and Greed. So the verse is, no man is able to be a servant to two masters, for he will have hate for the one and love for the other, or he will keep to one and have no respect for the other. You may not be servants of God and of wealth. So, what the point that Jesus is trying to bring out here in this particular verse is that one cannot serve two masters. Wealth and God, they cannot be served at the same time. One has to be kept subservient. We, in our own nature, cannot be answerable on equal terms to two masters. Our own nature is that we bend down before a single master. And if we have two masters, then one is bound to prevail on the other. And if we have greed, like God, if we have the idol of greed standing before us, besides God, then we are bound to be overcome with this greed. So what Jesus is actually cautioning us is that if we are trying to please both God and also to gather wealth, and of course here it's not the ordinary wealth that is being spoken of. It's basically this wealth which is a means of showing off, this wealth which is absolutely redundant, which we don't need, which is there in our coffers, in our treasuries, merely for the sake of being there, and we have no use of it except that we keep on counting it. So Jesus is cautioning us and prodding us that if you make greed as something of your God, as close to something as God Himself, you'll find out that you have given yourself up to the God of greed. The real God has been pushed away from your own sight, because human nature is that it cannot serve two masters. It's either God or it's either something else. Two things cannot be worshipped at the same time. Two things cannot be our masters at the same time. And as I said earlier on, you can clearly see, dear viewers, that this is a mere translation of what might Jesus had uttered on behalf of the Almighty, originally in his own language. And we can well imagine, if the original had survived, how effective these words, which already are in the translation, would have been in the original. And in the absence of the original, although the translation still moves us, but we can well imagine that in the presence of the original words, how effectively they would have made their influence on our hearts and on our soul. Remember, it's very important that we as individuals address both our soul, our mind at the same time. And soul and mind and our emotional self, they are intertwined. We are not mere emotion, we are not mere intellect. We are a combination of both intellect and emotion. So all those verses of divine scriptures in which the emotional aspect and the intellectual aspect is intertwined, it has a tremendous influence on ourselves. And this is where we weaklings, we earthlings, need this influence. We need this effect, because this is the only way through which we can actually reach God. This is the only way in which our connection with God stands to be in a position, in a manner in which we find it growing from strength to more strength. So with these words, I'll come to an end to the first segment of our study circle. And if there are any questions which relate specifically to what we have just discussed, I'll be glad to answer them. And after that, we'll inshallah go on to the next segment. So please let me know if you have any questions on the Bible verse that we have just studied, and similarly the Quranic verse that we have studied earlier on, and also the Hadith of the Prophet. So all of them have a message for us. They tell us how we have to conduct ourselves as individuals, and they have a very important message for our daily lives. So should we move on in case there is no question regarding the first segment? So could you tell us if we can proceed, Shukib Saab? Is there a question in the pipeline? So it seems that there is no question at the moment. So let's move on to the next part of our study circle segment, and that is a common misconception that is uh, part of our own study, and as it's part of our own journey towards finding out the truth regarding Islam and the religion of God. So the misconception, dear viewers, that I'm going to bring before you today relates to the political directive, or I would say some of the political directives of Islam, which have been misinterpreted, and they generally make us feel as if Islam has also told us that in case of our selection of the topmost brass of our rulers, certain stipulations have to be met. And let me now go into a little more detail so as to point out this particular misconception. So there is a hadith of the Prophet which says that the rulers should belong to the Quraysh. The Prophet is supposed to have said, Al-a'immatu min Quraysh, which means that after I pass away, after I die, the ruling party has to be from the Quraysh, which is, of course, the tribe of the Prophet. Now, if this hadith is interpreted the way we interpret it, if we don't interpret it in the light of the Quran and give it an absolute meaning and an independent existence, it will tell us that the Prophet is actually advocating the fact that once he passes away, only people who belong to his tribe, the Quraysh tribe, are the ones who should be selected for the purpose of being rulers or as rulers of the Muslims. And let me tell you that this has been a very, very sore thorn in our own ranks, because if this is true, the way it has been presented, it only means that merit is being sacrificed. And the Prophet is saying that as long as a person belongs to his tribe, supposedly, as long as a person belongs to the Quraysh, he can be selected. However, a person, if he is competent, if he may be very, very fit for the job, but does not belong to the tribe of the Quraysh, then he should not be selected for this job. And I would like to remind you, many years ago, that when the Khilafat movement was rampant in the subcontinent, and people were actually trying to convince Mustafa Kemal Ataturk that he should not annul the caliphate. One of the reasons which actually was behind this whole scenario was that the 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 Khalifa had to be someone who should belong to the Quraysh tribe. And if he does not belong to the Quraysh tribe, then he is not eligible to be the Khalifa or the ruler of the Muslims. So, as you can see, this particular hadith has gone as far as to make us realize the fact that basically it's the tribe of the Prophet. It's not merit, it's not competence, it is belonging to a certain tribe which makes a person eligible to become the ruler of Muslims. So, as I said, if this particular verse of this particular hadith is interpreted independently without connecting it with the Quran, this is how it will ultimately come out. It will come out as a very, very, if I am allowed to say, a very, very ugly uh, statement, supposedly ascribed to the Prophet, in which a person like the Prophet, who was the biggest and one of the greatest proponents of justice, one of the greatest proponents of merit, is actually saying that if a person is very competent but does not belong to his tribe, he is not eligible to become the ruler of the Muslims. Now, let me point out that how we understand this hadith and how actually it has become a very complexly or a very ambiguous narrative from the Prophet, because it has been not related to its basis in the Quran. We need to understand that we have to relate every single narrative that we find with a certain basis which is found in the Quran or in the established norms of sense and reason. Now, we need to understand that there is a basic Quranic word which says, Amruhum Shura Bainahum, which means that the system of the Muslims will be conducted on the basis of consultation, on the basis of mutual consultation. So, Muslim rulers will be elected on the basis of consultation of the masses. In other words, if there is any difference in the majority, if there is a difference in the consensus, if there is not a complete consensus, the rule of the majority will prevail. And whoever enjoys the confidence of the majority will be considered as elected. And of course, this is no different from what today we can see in democracies and in democratic setups. So the earliest example of this democracy can be seen in this Quranic verse in which it says, Amruhum Shura Bainahum, that the system of government of the Muslims will be run through their mutual consultation. And the obvious corollary of this is that the opinion of the majority shall prevail. Of course, this does not mean that the opinion of the majority is right. So it's not that the correctness of a particular view has to be judged through this. The only thing is that the person who enjoys this confidence, who enjoys the confidence of the majority, is entitled to become the ruler. Now, in the times of the Prophet, what happened was that the Quraysh enjoyed this particular aspect. They enjoyed the confidence of the majority. And the Prophet knew, because there were no elections that could have taken place or would have taken place in those times because of the peculiar circumstances. And the way this majority opinion was elicited was through the leaders of the tribes themselves. So, in order to caution and prod them, the Prophet said that it is today that the Quraysh enjoy the confidence of the majority. They are the ones through whom you can see that they are the ones in whom the majority puts their trust into. So once I pass away, because they are the majority party, they are the ones who enjoy the majority opinion. So you must select your rulers for them. In other words, it was an ordinance which related to the times of the Prophet. It was something which never belonged to, which never was an eternal directive of the Prophet. It was never meant to be said that all the times, on every occasion, the ruler has to be from among the Quraysh. No, this is not the case. In the times of the Prophet, the Quraysh enjoyed the majority of the people of Arabia, and therefore they were eligible to rule. And as long as this majority, of course, would have been enjoyed by them, they had this right to rule. And this is precisely what the Prophet said. In other words, whatever the Prophet said was merely an application of the Quranic verse, Amruhum Shura Bainahum, which meant that just as the people who are in majority other people can stake their claim. And let me tell you that this is what happened in the time of the Prophet. In the Saqifa of Bani Saida, the Ansar, the other people or the other group, which was, of course, opposing the Muhajirun. So the Muhajirun were actually the people who were enjoying the majority. But the Ansar in the Saqifa of Bani Saida said that since the Prophet had consulted them in the case whenever he would be in Medina, so therefore a person who is to be elected from amongst the Muslims after the Prophet must belong to the Ansar. And it is here when they were reminded that the Prophet had said sometime before his death that the Aimma or the rulers shall belong to the Muhajirun, that they got reminded and said, yes, the Prophet had said this. So in other words, the Prophet, seeing that an untoward situation might arise after this death, after his own death, and some dispute might take place between the Muhajirun and the Ansar as to who enjoys the majority confidence of the masses. The Prophet, before he passed away, actually told them that the majority confidence is enjoyed by the Quraysh, and as long as it is enjoyed by the Quraysh, the rulers shall be selected from them. So this is how the Prophet actually tried to make matters simple for them, so that people don't get entangled in a dispute right after he passes away. So in other words, the Hadith Al-Aimatu min Quraysh does not mean at all that the rulers of the Quraysh or the rulers of the Muslims shall always belong to the Quraysh. No, this is not the case. This is a temporary ordinance which was given for the times of the Prophet, in which the Quraysh enjoyed the majority confidence. And it meant that till they enjoyed the majority confidence, rulers shall come from them. But once they lose this majority amongst the masses, this is not going to hold at all. So there is this very important aspect that we have to relate a hadith to its basis in the Quran. And if we don't do so, we'll end up interpreting a hadith independently, and at times, as is the case in this particular issue, we'll end up introducing something very, very alien in the Quran. Islam does not recognize this in any way anything which is against marriage. It does not recognize a tribe merely because it belongs to the Prophet. The Prophet never said that rulers have to be from his tribe, come what may. He never said these words. What he meant, if we interpret his word in the light of the Quran, was that as long as the ruling party has to be considered, it has to be considered, and it must be considered, then as a matter of fact, this ruling party is the Quraysh, because this is how the Arabs in those times behaved. They put their trust in the Quraysh. But it also meant that once the Quraysh lost this confidence, or they would lose this confidence later on, then they would no longer be eligible for this position. So this, in a brief nutshell, is how I would like to explain this particular misconception that has arisen, and unfortunately has become a very important institute of Islamic political system. And every time that we study a political system which is based on Islamic thought, we find that the foremost criteria for a caliph, for a ruler of the Muslims, is that he must belong to the Quraysh, because they think that this hadith is actually something which is for all times to come. And by not understanding its background and by not interpreting this hadith in the light of the Quran, they end up introducing into the corpus of religion something which is entirely not meant the way they have understood it. So with these words, I come to the end of the second segment as well. So my dear viewers, if you have any question regarding this second part of my talk, I'll be glad to answer them. And it's also now open for any other question that you may have.
Rafiq, I just have a question, if you don't mind unmuting for a moment.
Please go ahead.
If you click on the mic right next to her name,
So I can hear you now. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to first mention that I couldn't see anything on the screen today on your webinar, none of the Quran script. I don't know if it was my problem or was it a general webinar problem. My question is that in what you just explained about the hadith, I wanted to know, there's a lot of controversy going on regarding an appointment of an advisor in Pakistan whose they claim is not a Muslim because he's Ahmadi. I wanted to know, does Islam say anything regarding any appointments of a non-Muslim who we consider non-Muslim as advisor on economics or a part to help the government in their problems? This is my first question.
Okay, there are two aspects to your question. First is that what Islam says about this, and the second part, which of course relates to this scenario, is that in Pakistan we have a constitution in force, and in that constitution a particular stance has been adopted regarding the Ahmadi community. So I'll make a comment on both of these separately. Now, as far as the first issue is concerned, there is absolutely nothing which hinders anything in the election of a person who may be of any religion to a position of importance in the government. There is absolutely no such hindrance. Nothing stops us from electing a person who is competent enough for this purpose, and whether his faith is whether he's of a Muslim faith or any other faith, he could even be an atheist. That's not a concern, as long as he is discharging his duty to which he had been appointed. This is what I think is the stance of Islam. Now, As far as what has happened in Pakistan is that about 45 years ago, the Ahmadi community was declared as non-Muslims. In my personal opinion, this is something which had actually crossed limits because, according to the Quran, no one is given this right to declare any community or any person as a non-Muslim. The only person who has this right is the Almighty Himself, and He has not delegated this right to any of us. So hence we had no right to do so. But this is a matter of the past. It had happened 45 years ago, and it was an unfortunate happening. And the way it happened and the way it is continuing to go along is no less than persecution. So this is how I would say that as far as the constitution is concerned, it does declare the Ahmadi community as non-Muslim, and also the fact that it has certain reservations about the Ahmadi community. But as I said, as far as the Islamic institutes are concerned themselves, they have no such stipulations. A third thing that I'd like to add here is that even if they are considered to be non-Muslims, the way our constitution in Pakistan says, even then, let me point out that there is an article which is called Article 27 of our Constitution. You can just Google it. Just Google Article 27 of the Constitution of Pakistan, and it will come up. It's just a 4 or 5 line article. And the gist of this article is that any person who, regardless of caste, creed, religion, birth, gender, has any competence for a particular job, then he cannot be denied that job merely because his caste, creed, or religion, or birth, or gender was something that is objectionable or maybe not in agreement to a certain lot of people. So I would say that even in this situation, the Constitution of Pakistan, Article 27, is absolutely clear. It says that regardless of religion, the real thing that shall be kept in consideration for the selection of an individual is his competence or her competence and not his or her faith. So I would say that as far as the Constitution of Pakistan is concerned regarding declaring the Ahmadi community as non-Muslim, in the first aspect, first instance, this happened 45 years ago. It was an unfortunate happening. It shouldn't have happened. But since it has happened, there is no way out but to, of course, accept it because, and still at the same time, while accepting it, we have this right to criticize this amendment of the Constitution. But people who even accept this, they must understand that once you even accept the Ahmadis as non-Muslims, then there is this Article 27 which says that whatever the religion of a person, you cannot debar him from any public office if he or she has the competence and ability to discharge the role of that office.
Thank you, Shehzad Sahab. Just one quick request to everyone. When you have a question, we leave your mic open. So it is up to you to kindly mute yourself so there's no disturbance for the rest of the class because obviously you're at your house or some other place and there's background noise. Rafi Saiba, your mic is open. Does that complete your question?
Um, my next question is that if a child is adopted from an orphanage and one does not know his parents, because normally in Pakistan they sometimes they don't know the parents. So how can you tell the child about his real parents or give them a name? I listened to one of Ramdi Saab's clip in which he said that the child must be told the name.
Quran says in Surah Azab that if you know the lineage of the parentage of a child, you cannot hide it. It does not say that you can name a person differently. You can keep your own name with that or that boy or that girl's name, but you have to disclose the real parents if you know them. And if you do not know the real parents, then of course this is how you should tell who are actually adopted that child. That basically what has happened is that although we have adopted you as a child, but we are not aware of your actual parents. So we are giving you our own name for the sake of giving our own name. But this does not mean that you are our son or our daughter. So the bottom line is that you have to make it clear to the adopted child who his or her parents are. It does not preclude the fact that as a result, you cannot add your own name to that boy's or girl's name. You can always add the name. There's not a problem with adding your own name. The only thing is that besides adding the name, you must tell him that you are that person, that boy or that girl is not your real child. And at the same time, also, if you don't know the parent's name or you don't know the parentage, because there are many orphanages in which it is very difficult to find out who the original parent was, then this particular information has to be divulged, in which you tell the child that you have been adopted and you have different parents, and as far as who those parents were are concerned, we have no knowledge, unfortunately. So all this information is divulged, is close to the adoptive child. The purpose of Islam and the purpose of the Quran stands fulfilled.
Okay, and also thank you so much. My last question is, a lot of people are told to recite different surahs and du'as and say that, okay, if you, like your child is given an exam, say this certain ayat 1,000 times, or if you are sick, somebody's sick, say another one 1,000 times, Ayatul Kursi or Ayatul Karima. Or so I just wanted to know that, does the number have any significance for Allah to accept your dua? If I want pray to Allah for something, can I just ask once sincerely, or do I have to say it 100 times for it to be accepted?
So, as a principle, these enchantments, I would say, or these chantings of 100 times, of 200 times, you'll find that none of them has any basis in the original sources of Islam. None of them. What Islam actually tells us, the Quran tells us, and the Hadith of the Prophet tells us, is that if you have something that you want to be fulfilled, you have to make dua for that person or for your own self. And you do it once, you can do it twice in your own words. And what it tells us is that the best time to make dua is to get up at the time of the Hajjud, because that is the time when the Almighty wants us to make this sacrifice of our own sleep in the last part of the night, get up and pray to Him. So what we need to tell us, our own selves, and to other people who are in needs for something, and they want their duas to be fulfilled, is that they should get the time of the Hajjud as far as they can and make their own dua earnestly before the Almighty. And as far as this practice is concerned, which we are told that if we recite a certain surah a certain number of times, and then certain wishes that we have in our mind will be fulfilled, I can tell you without any contradiction that it has absolutely no basis anywhere in the original authentic sources of the Quran and Hadith themselves. There is no such thing. They have generally been made up by our scholars, and the basis of this making up has been that there are certain weak narratives, at times concocted narratives, which say so. But none of the authentic narratives that we have says anything of this sort. We find, on the contrary, the beautiful du'as of the Prophet himself, beautiful du'as recited in the Quran from various prophets, which actually tell us that they used to pray to the Almighty, they would make dua to the Almighty. And in the case of Prophet himself in particular, he was a very regular tahajjud offerer. He would get up at this time and he would actually whisper to the Almighty, as a certain hadith says. His whisperings would be heard by the Almighty because he would be talking to the Almighty. So the legacy that He has left for us is that we should get up at that time, and instead of going after different things which have no authenticity, which have no basis in the original sources, the best thing that we can do is invoke the Almighty's help as much as we can. And even if we do not have the words in Arabic in our mind, simply uttering what we have in our mind in our own language and pleading before the Almighty, prostrating before Him at the time of the Hajj. This is what actually stirs His mercy. This is what His mercy is all about. And I wish that we can make this more common in our Muslim Ummah and tell them that whenever we have some need to be fulfilled, the best time is to get up at the time of the Hajj, pray to the Almighty, and prostrate before Him.
So, Dr. Shehzad, just to clarify this further, I've heard about many times I've been invited when somebody is very sick and they say, okay, we are reading 1 lakh times Ayat Karima for this person who's sick. and I have joined them, but now I'm confused. I mean, does it mean anything to sit there and
So,
read it?
if you just go through the meanings of the ayat karima, which says La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu minaz zalimin, all it says is that there is no God except you. Glory be to you. I have sinned and I beg for forgiveness. You can clearly see that these words have no bearing on, for example, asking for the cure of a sickness of any other person. They relate purely to our own self. They say, as, as if something that we have done wrong, at the time of that, we realize that we've done something wrong. And the best expression of expressing our regret, of expressing our apologies to the Almighty is that we tell Him that we have sinned, we have done something wrong, we glorify you, we express our belief in your Tawheed, please forgive us. So you can see how they relate to a person himself, especially if he has done something wrong. It has no bearing at all to the cure for a certain disease. So Ayat Karima and other similar verses, most of them have absolutely, as I said, no bearing on the issue at all. They have sprung up in the last couple of centuries and have become very prominent. And one of the reasons for this is that people think that this is a hotline with the Almighty, in which once it is pressed, our demands are conveyed to the Almighty, and it is now up to Him to answer them. This is absolutely something which is alien to the Quran, I would say. And if you read the Quran, you'll find out what it tells us is that we have to connect ourselves to the Almighty. It is the strong God connection in us which has this ability or maybe the force to stir the mercy of God. So if you want God's mercy to really answer you, then you have to address the Almighty directly in plain, simple words. If you do not know the words of the prophets or the du'as of the prophets, then even our own simple, plain words should be sufficient to offer the dua to the Almighty.
There are no other questions. So if anyone has a question, please click on raise hand before we end the class. I think we're done today. Thank you very much. Inshallah, next Saturday.
Well,
Thank you,
thank you
everyone.
very much. Thank you very much. See you, inshallah, on the next Saturday. Allah Hafiz.